Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a world that is often imagined as loud, brutal, and chaotic, but which, in its quieter hours, was shaped by habit, order, belief, and necessity. When the fire burned low in a Viking hall, daily life did not simply stop, changed pace. Night was the time when the household gathered itself, when work was finished or set aside, when stories, repair, prayer, caution, and preparation all became part of survival. And in a world without electric light, without modern security, and without the comforts we take for granted, the hours before sleep could reveal just as much about Viking life as battle or voyage ever did. If you enjoy thoughtful long-form history like this, subscribe and stay with the channel. A lot of regular viewers do, simply so they don't miss these calm deep dives into the past. And it really helps keep this kind of careful, slower history going. To understand a Viking night routine, we first have to clear away a modern misunderstanding. The word Viking is often used as if it describes a single type of person, usually a raider with an axe standing on the prow of a ship. But most people in the Viking Age were not constantly raiding. They were farmers, fishers, craftspeople, traders, landowners, household workers, children, elders, and travelers. The Viking Age, usually dated from the late 8th century to the mid-11th century, covered a wide stretch of Scandinavia and connected worlds beyond it, from the British Isles to the rivers of Eastern Europe and even to the North Atlantic settlements. So when we talk about a Viking night routine, we are really talking about the evening habits of Norse households in a demanding northern environment. The details could vary by region, wealth, season, and occupation, but the broad structure of the evening was shaped by the same pressures. Darkness, cold, animals, family labor, limited resources, and the need to prepare constantly for the next day. For most of the year, light defined everything. In Scandinavia, daylight hours changed dramatically with the seasons. In summer, the evening could stretch on, especially in the far north, while winter brought long periods of darkness. That meant a night routine in January was not the same as a night routine in July. In winter, much more life was pulled indoors. The longhouse became the center of existence. This was not simply a place to sleep. It was a shelter, workshop, kitchen, storeroom, social space, and symbol of status. Entering the hall in the evening meant entering the core of the household economy. The day's outside work might be ending, but that did not mean rest began immediately. In fact, some of the most important work of the day could happen once everyone was back inside. As dusk approached, one of the first priorities was the fire. Fire was warmth, light, cooked food, protection, and routine. In a typical Norse longhouse, the hearth ran down the center or occupied a key interior space, with smoke venting imperfectly through roof openings. This meant the air inside could be thick with smoke, especially in colder months when openings were limited. To modern people, that would seem deeply uncomfortable, and it probably often was, but it was also normal. Smoke could help preserve timbers, deter insects, and dry clothing hanging inside. In the evening, keeping the fire alive mattered. Someone had to feed it, manage it, and judge how much fuel could be spared overnight. Too little, and the hall would grow dangerously cold. Too much, and precious fuel would be wasted. In a world where gathering wood and peat required time and effort, Even the shape of the fire reflected household discipline. Then came the evening meal, though meal can sound more formal than reality. Viking food depended heavily on season, status, and local environment. A household might eat barley or rye bread, porridge, stew, dried or salted fish, dairy products, preserved meat, root vegetables, or whatever had been stored successfully. Fresh food was not always available, and the ability to preserve enough for winter was one of the great tests of household management. The evening meal was not only about hunger. It was also a moment of accounting. How much remained in storage? Whether livestock were healthy? Whether weather threatened future supplies? Whether guests had arrived? Whether workers, kin, or dependents needed feeding? Hospitality mattered in Norse society, but hospitality was never separate from resources. Offering food and warmth carried social meaning, yet every household knew that generosity had practical limits. After eating, the hall did not fall silent. In many ways, evening was a second working day, only one conducted indoors and under firelight. Clothing had to be mended, nets repaired, tools checked, rope twisted, wood carved, wool spun. Weaving, one of the most labor-intensive tasks in Norse life, was deeply bound to the rhythm of the household, and evening hours were valuable for such work. Textile production was not minor domestic decoration. It was economic power. Sailcloth, clothing, blankets, and everyday fabric all depended on skilled labor, much of it performed by women, though household work in practice involved many hands. The image of Vikings as purely outward-looking seafarers misses this entirely. Ships themselves depended on the quiet, repetitive, unglamorous labor of home. A voyage began not at sea, but in the evening routines of people who processed wool, repaired garments, conserved supplies, and turned a household into a functioning system. Children, too, would have been part of this environment, though not in the highly scheduled way familiar to modern families. They learned by presence, imitation, instruction, and responsibility. An evening in a Viking household was one of the classrooms of life. A child could observe how adults handled tools, measured food, spoke to guests, responded to weather, managed hierarchy, and remembered obligations. This mattered because Viking Age society relied heavily on memory and custom. Not everyone was literate, and even where runes were known, writing was not the main container of everyday knowledge. Knowledge lived in habit, speech, and repeated action. The routine of the hall taught people how to belong. Storytelling likely played an important part in these hours as well, though we should be careful not to imagine every evening as a theatrical saga performance. The later Icelandic sagas, written down centuries after the earliest Viking Age, preserve a world where reputation, ancestry, feuds, law, and memory were central. In real households, stories could educate, entertain, warn, and reinforce identity. Genealogies mattered. So did examples of good judgment and disastrous pride. To hear about an ancestor, a journey, a settlement dispute, a king, or a god was not simply leisure. It helped place the listener in a moral and social landscape. Night, with darkness outside and the household gathered close, was the perfect setting for that kind of transmission. The stories told in such moments helped explain who a family was, where it came from, and what behavior the world demanded. Religion and belief could also shape the transition into night. In the earlier Viking Age, Norse pagan practices formed part of daily and seasonal life, though not always in the dramatic temple-centered way once imagined. Ritual could be domestic, local, practical, and woven into ordinary experience. The unseen world was not far away in Norse thought. Gods, land spirits, luck, fate, omens, and the dangerous uncertainty of life all existed close to the household imagination. Later, as Christianity spread through Scandinavia, night routines in some places would gradually reflect new practices, symbols, and prayers. That change did not happen everywhere at once. For a long time, old and new beliefs overlapped. What remained constant was the sense that night made people more aware of vulnerability. Darkness sharpened the boundary between the safe, known interior and the uncertain exterior beyond the walls. That exterior could not be ignored. Before settling for the night, animals had to be checked or secured. Doors and openings mattered. In some farms, livestock were housed very near people, sometimes even within connected structures, because animals were wealth, transport, labor, status, and survival. Losing them to cold, theft, or neglect could be disastrous. A Viking night routine, therefore, included vigilance. This was not paranoia. It was practicality. Storms could rise. Predators could threaten. Strangers could appear. In politically unstable regions, violence or theft was never impossible. Even on ordinary nights, the household head or other responsible members had reason to think about security in simple, immediate terms. Was the fire safe enough? Were the animals settled? Was the weather changing? Was the boat secured? Was there enough fuel ready for morning? Sleep itself was different from modern expectations. People did not retire into private bedrooms with soft mattresses and uniform bedding. In many longhouses, sleeping spaces were arranged along the sides of the structure, often on raised platforms or benches. Bedding might include furs, woolen blankets, stuffed mattresses, or straw depending on wealth and circumstance. People often slept near one another, with little privacy by modern standards. Warmth was shared because it had to be. Sleep in such an environment was social, practical, and seasonal. Could also be interrupted. Fires needed tending. Infants woke. Weather changed. Animals made noise. Travelers arrived late. The night was not always a sealed block of rest. It was part of a living cycle in which sleep, watchfulness, and obligation could overlap. Even the body adjusted to this world differently. Without modern lighting, circadian rhythms were more directly shaped by sunset, season, and firelight. In deep winter, long darkness did not necessarily mean endless sleep, but it did mean more time spent in dim conditions, with activity clustered around the hearth. In summer, routines stretched later. Labor needs could override comfort in any season. A fisherman, sailor, or farmer did not keep the night in the same way as someone in a sheltered elite household. Still, across classes, one principle remained. Night was when the household narrowed around what mattered most. Heat, food, repair, kinship, memory. caution, preparation. This is one of the reasons the subject is so revealing. A Viking night routine was not impressive because it was exotic. It was important because it shows us the real engine of Norse life. Not the raid, but the return home. Not the heroic image, but the disciplined household that made survival possible. The famous outward expansion of the Viking world, its ships, trade routes, settlements, and political ambitions, depended on ordinary evenings in smoky halls where people measured stores, patched clothing, managed animals, told stories, watched the fire, and prepared to do it all again the next day. When we imagine the Viking Age only through conquest, we miss the harder truth. Durable societies are built at the end of the day. As the evening deepened in a Viking household, the pace of life slowed, but it rarely became completely quiet. The glow of the hearth would cast uneven light across wooden beams, tools, woven fabrics, and the everyday objects that made the hall function. Shadows moved constantly along the walls as flames shifted and people continued their small tasks. These quieter hours were often when the practical rhythms of Norse life revealed themselves most clearly. While the outside world faded into darkness, the interior of the longhouse remained active with a calm, deliberate sense of purpose. One important aspect of the night routine was preparation for the following morning. In a society where survival depended heavily on timing and readiness, the next day's work often began the night before. Fishing gear might be checked and carefully coiled. Farming tools could be placed near the doorway so they were ready at first light. If a boat journey was planned, oars, ropes, and simple supplies needed to be prepared in advance. The same was true during seasons of travel or trade. Merchants and sailors leaving early could not afford delays caused by missing equipment or poorly prepared cargo. In this way, the Viking night routine was not simply about ending the day. It was about ensuring the next one would begin smoothly. Food preparation could also continue after the main meal. Preserving food was an ongoing responsibility, especially in colder climates where winter survival depended on careful storage. Fish might be hung to dry near the smoky rafters, where the heat and smoke helped preserve it. Meat could be salted or smoked, and dairy products such as butter or cheese required monitoring and maintenance. These processes did not always demand constant attention, but they required regular checks. Evening provided a convenient moment for this work because the household was already gathered inside. The structure of the Viking longhouse itself influenced how these activities unfolded. Most longhouses were long, rectangular buildings constructed from timber, turf, or stone depending on local materials. The central hearth divided the interior space, while benches or platforms along the sides served multiple purposes. During the day, these platforms might function as seating or working areas, but at night they were transformed into sleeping places. Animal skins, wool blankets, and stuffed bedding were spread out, creating a simple but functional sleeping arrangement. Lighting in the evening came primarily from the fire and from small oil lamps. These lamps were typically fueled with animal fat or fish oil and produced a dim but steady light. Compared to modern lighting, the illumination was extremely limited. Only a small area of the hall would be clearly visible, while the rest remained in soft shadow. This limited light shaped how people used the evening hours. Work that required fine precision was usually finished earlier in the day. Tasks done at night were often those that could be performed by touch or habit, such as spinning wool or repairing nets. These moments of repetitive work also created an environment where conversation flowed naturally. While we cannot know exactly what every Viking family discussed in the evening, we can reasonably assume that daily concerns dominated much of the talk. Weather patterns were carefully observed and discussed because they influenced crops, fishing conditions, and travel safety. News from neighboring farms or settlements might circulate through visiting travelers. Trade opportunities, local disputes, or rumors of distant political changes could all become topics of conversation. In larger or wealthier households, the evening could also include visitors. Hospitality held an important place in Norse culture, and travelers often depended on the generosity of farmsteads along their routes. Offering food, warmth, and a place to sleep was not only an act of kindness but also a way of strengthening social networks. News and information moved through these networks, carried by merchants, sailors, and wandering storytellers. For a Viking household, hosting a guest in the evening might mean hearing stories from far beyond the local valley, perhaps news from a distant trading port, or accounts of political struggles between kings and chieftains. Even in these quieter moments, the outside environment remained a constant presence in people's minds. Scandinavian winters were long and unpredictable, and storms could develop quickly. Many households kept a habit of stepping outside briefly before sleep to observe the sky, the wind, and the condition of nearby animals or boats. These small checks were practical acts of caution. A sudden shift in wind might threaten fishing equipment or unsecured boats along the shore. Heavy snowfall or freezing rain could damage structures or trap livestock. Being attentive to such details was part of everyday survival. Gradually, as the fire burned lower and the household began settling down, people prepared their sleeping areas. Bedding was arranged carefully to retain as much warmth as possible. Thick furs and wool blankets were valuable possessions, particularly in colder regions. Families often slept close together, sharing body heat in a practical response to harsh climates. Privacy, as we understand it today, was not a central concern in most Viking homes. Instead, the focus was on warmth, safety, and efficient use of limited space. The final moments before sleep could vary from household to household. Some families may have offered brief prayers or quiet words tied to their beliefs, whether rooted in traditional Norse religion or, in later centuries, in Christianity as it spread through Scandinavia. Others may have simply allowed conversation to fade naturally as exhaustion from the day's work took over. In a world without artificial light, fatigue followed the natural rhythm of darkness, and sleep often arrived earlier than it does in modern societies. Yet even as the household drifted toward rest, the Viking night was rarely completely silent. The crackling of the fire, the shifting of animals nearby, the occasional creak of timber in the wind, or the distant sound of waves along a shore could all be heard in the darkness. These sounds formed part of the familiar environment of Viking life. They reminded people that the world outside the longhouse was still active, even while the household slept. In this way, the Viking night routine was not simply a pause between 2 days of work. It was a carefully balanced period of preparation, conversation, and cautious rest. Within the dim light of the longhouse, families maintained the habits and responsibilities that allowed them to survive in a demanding northern landscape. And while the heroic image of the Viking Age often focuses on ships, battles, and exploration, the true foundation of that world was built quietly each night around the steady glow of the hearth. As the night continued, the longhouse gradually settled into a quieter rhythm, though true silence was rare. The central fire was usually reduced rather than extinguished. Someone in the household often had the responsibility of managing the embers so that the fire could be easily revived in the morning. Allowing the fire to go completely cold could mean a difficult start to the next day, especially during the colder months. Restarting a fire from scratch required time, dry materials, and effort, so keeping a controlled bed of embers overnight was both practical and efficient. During winter, maintaining warmth inside the longhouse was essential for survival. The thick walls of turf, timber, or stone provided insulation, but the structure was never completely sealed from the outside environment. Cold air could slip through small openings, and wind sometimes found its way through the roof vent where smoke escaped. Because of this, sleeping arrangements were designed to preserve as much heat as possible. People often lay close together beneath layers of wool blankets and animal furs. In some homes, even the positioning of sleepers mattered, with the warmest areas near the hearth reserved for elders, young children, or honored guests. Night also carried a psychological weight that people in modern illuminated societies rarely experience. Darkness in the Viking Age was deep and complete. Once someone stepped outside the longhouse, the world could become almost entirely black except for moonlight or starlight. This kind of darkness shaped how people thought about the night. It encouraged caution and reinforced the feeling that the longhouse was a protective space against an uncertain outside world. Because of this, doors and entryways were often secured before sleep. While large-scale attacks were uncommon in most daily situations, theft or wandering animals were genuine concerns. Farms were valuable places, containing food stores, livestock, tools, and equipment necessary for survival. A poorly secured door could allow animals to escape or invite unwanted visitors. Checking these small details became part of the nightly routine. For many households, the last person awake might spend a few quiet moments simply observing the hall. Fires dimmed, tools resting in their places, the steady breathing of family members already asleep. In these moments, the head of the household or another responsible adult could reflect on the state of the farm or community. Were the animals healthy? Had enough food been preserved for the coming months? Would the weather allow work to continue tomorrow? These reflections were not philosophical in the modern sense. They were practical thoughts connected to survival. Viking society depended heavily on planning and resilience. One poor harvest, one harsh winter, or one failed trading season could place an entire household at risk. The evening hours, therefore, often became a natural time for quiet assessment of the household situation. Eventually, as the embers glowed softly and conversation disappeared entirely, sleep would settle across the longhouse. Outside, the northern night stretched over fields, forests, and fjords. The ships tied along the shore rocked gently with the movement of the water. Livestock shifted in nearby shelters, and the cold Scandinavian air moved silently across the landscape. Inside the hall, however, warmth and community remained. The Viking night routine, simple as it might appear, was one of the foundations of life in the Viking Age. It was within these nightly habits, watching the fire, preparing for morning, protecting the household, and resting beside family, that the strength of Norse society quietly endured. As the household slept, the night outside the longhouse continued its slow movement across the northern landscape. In many parts of Scandinavia, the natural environment never truly disappeared from daily awareness. Even in sleep, people remained loosely connected to the sounds around them. A sudden storm, a restless animal, or the distant barking of dogs could easily wake someone. Life in the Viking Age demanded a certain level of alertness even during rest. The presence of animals played an important role in this nighttime environment. On many farms, livestock such as sheep, goats, or cattle were kept in nearby structures, and in some cases parts of the longhouse itself were connected to animal shelters. This arrangement helped conserve warmth during colder seasons and made it easier to monitor valuable animals through the night. Livestock were essential to survival, providing milk, meat, wool, leather, and labor. Losing animals to illness, predators, or exposure could damage a household's ability to endure the winter. Because of this, unusual sounds from nearby animals could quickly bring someone awake. Dogs were especially important companions during the night. Archaeological evidence and historical sources suggest that dogs were common in Norse households, serving roles as guards, hunters, and general companions. A dog's sharp hearing made it an early warning system. If a stranger approached the farmstead, if wildlife moved too close to livestock, or if something unusual disturbed the quiet landscape, dogs would often react long before humans noticed anything. Their presence added another layer of security to the nighttime routine. Weather also remained a constant concern. Scandinavian weather can change rapidly, especially near coastlines and mountain regions. A calm evening could shift into strong winds or heavy snowfall during the night. For fishermen or traders who relied on boats, storms could threaten vessels tied along the shore. In farming regions, severe weather might damage fences, roofs, or stored supplies. Even while resting, people were aware that the natural world could change conditions quickly. Inside the longhouse, sleep itself was often lighter and more flexible than modern patterns. Some historians believe that people in pre-industrial societies sometimes experienced what is called segmented sleep. Instead of one long, uninterrupted sleep period, individuals might wake briefly during the night before returning to rest again. These waking moments were not necessarily seen as a problem. People might add fuel to the fire, check on animals, or simply lie quietly before falling asleep again. Seasonal light patterns also shaped the experience of night. During the height of winter, darkness could last for many hours, encouraging longer periods indoors. Families spent more time close to the hearth, sharing warmth and conserving energy. In contrast, during the bright northern summers, darkness might be very short. In some areas, the sky never became completely black. This meant that evening routines could stretch later, and people might rise earlier to take advantage of the long daylight hours. Over time, as Christianity gradually spread through Scandinavia between the 10th and 12th centuries, nighttime practices slowly began to change in certain communities. Christian prayers or quiet personal devotions sometimes became part of the routine before sleep. Churches and monasteries also introduced structured prayer times during the night in some regions. However, these religious influences developed gradually and often blended with older Norse traditions rather than replacing them immediately. What remained consistent across centuries was the role of the household as the center of life. The Viking Age is often remembered for exploration, trade routes, and dramatic encounters with distant lands. Yet those remarkable journeys always began and ended at places like the longhouse. Every voyage depended on the steady work of families maintaining farms, raising livestock, repairing tools, weaving sails, and preparing food. And so, each night, as the fire dimmed and the household rested, the foundation of Viking society quietly continued. Beneath the heavy beams of timber and turf roofs, surrounded by family, tools, and stored supplies, people slept knowing that the next morning would bring another day of work, responsibility, and survival in the demanding northern world they called home. As the darkest hours of the night passed, the longhouse existed in a kind of quiet balance between rest and readiness. The fire, reduced to a deep bed of glowing embers, continued to give off a steady warmth that spread slowly through the hall. The light was faint now, only a soft red glow that flickered against the wooden beams above. Most of the household slept, wrapped in wool and fur, but the environment inside the longhouse was never completely still. Breathing, shifting bodies, the quiet crackle of embers, and the occasional movement of animals nearby created a gentle background of sound. These subtle sounds were familiar to the people who lived in such homes. Over time, individuals became accustomed to recognizing which noises were ordinary and which required attention. The soft rustling of straw bedding or the shifting of livestock outside the wall was part of normal life. But an unusual sound, a sudden animal disturbance, a sharp gust of wind striking the structure, or a dog barking unexpectedly, could immediately bring someone awake. Living closely connected to the natural environment meant people learned to interpret small signals around them. The design of the longhouse itself contributed to this awareness. These buildings were strong and practical, but they were not silent structures. Timber frames responded to wind, roofs creaked slightly under changing temperatures, and the turf or wooden walls could carry outside sounds more easily than modern buildings. While this might seem uncomfortable to modern ears, for Viking Age families it created a constant connection between the interior world of the household and the outside landscape. Outside the hall, the Scandinavian night stretched over forests, rivers, mountains, and coastlines. In rural farming areas, the darkness could feel vast and quiet, broken only by wind through trees or the distant sound of water. Along coastal settlements, waves moving against the shore or harbor would form part of the nighttime atmosphere. Boats tied near landing places gently shifted with the tide, ropes creaking softly against wooden hulls. These boats were among the most valuable possessions many households owned. For fishermen, traders, and travelers, the condition of a boat could determine whether a family prospered or struggled. Because of this, people often remained attentive to weather conditions even during the night. Strong winds or sudden storms could threaten vessels left along the shoreline. A loose rope or poorly secured hull might cause serious damage before morning. In some cases, individuals might step outside briefly during the night to check the wind or confirm that equipment remained secure. Gradually, as the night continued, the cold often deepened. Temperatures frequently dropped in the hours before dawn, particularly during winter. This was one reason the careful management of the hearth fire mattered so much. Even a small amount of remaining heat could make a noticeable difference in the comfort of the hall. The thick layers of bedding also played an important role. Wool was especially valuable because of its ability to retain warmth even in damp conditions, making it ideal for the northern climate. Sleep during these hours was practical rather than luxurious. Viking Age people did not expect perfect comfort from their sleeping arrangements. Instead, sleep was treated as necessary recovery from the day's physical work. Farming, fishing, construction, travel, and craft production all required significant physical effort. By nightfall, exhaustion often made sleep come quickly despite the modest conditions. At the same time, sleep patterns were shaped by the seasonal rhythms of the northern world. During the long winter nights, people sometimes rested for extended periods, waking occasionally to adjust bedding or tend the fire. In summer, the shorter darkness meant rest could be lighter and shorter. Farmers and fishers often rose early to take advantage of the daylight hours, especially during important seasonal work such as planting, harvesting, or fishing runs. The approach of dawn slowly changed the atmosphere of the longhouse. Even before sunlight became visible, subtle signs of morning appeared. The darkness outside softened slightly, and the temperature of the air shifted. In coastal areas, seabirds sometimes began calling before the first light reached the horizon. Roosters or other domestic animals could also signal that the night was ending. Eventually, someone in the household would wake fully and move toward the hearth. The embers that had been carefully preserved through the night could now be stirred and fed with fresh fuel. Thin flames would return, gradually rebuilding the warmth and light that would fill the hall once again. This simple act, bringing the fire back to life, quietly marked the end of the Viking night routine and the beginning of a new day. Soon others would wake, bedding would be cleared away, and the platforms used for sleeping would return to their daytime roles as seating or workspaces. Outside, the fields, forests, and waters that sustained Viking society waited for another cycle of labor. And so the rhythm continued. Day after day, season after season, the Viking world moved forward through routines like these, not through constant battle or adventure, but through the steady, disciplined habits of ordinary life. Each night, families gathered around the hearth, repaired tools, shared food, checked their animals, and rested under the protection of the longhouse. And each morning, with the fire renewed and the light returning, the work of survival began again. Before the first clear light of dawn reached the landscape, the Viking household slowly began to shift from sleep back into movement. Often the first person to wake was someone with early responsibilities, perhaps the head of the household, a farm worker, or someone tasked with tending animals. In colder months especially, the most immediate priority was restoring the fire. The embers that had been protected overnight were gently stirred with a piece of wood or an iron tool, and small pieces of fuel were added. With patience, faint orange coals would brighten again, and thin flames would slowly return to life. The growing fire gradually brought warmth back into the longhouse. At the same time, it also restored the most important source of light inside the hall. Without it, the interior remained dim even after dawn began outside. As the flames strengthened, the familiar glow spread across the wooden beams, tools, benches, and sleeping platforms that had filled the hall throughout the night. One by one, other members of the household began to wake. Bedding made from wool blankets, animal skins, and stuffed mattresses was folded or rolled away. Since sleeping areas often doubled as seating or working spaces during the day, clearing these areas was an early morning task. This simple transition marked the official end of the night routine and the return of daytime activities. The sounds inside the longhouse slowly changed as people stirred. The quiet breathing and occasional movement of sleep gave way to footsteps on wooden floors, the crackling of fresh firewood, and the low voices of family members greeting the morning. In many homes, the first conversations of the day were practical and direct. Plans for work, weather observations, and the condition of animals were common topics. These were not formal meetings, but rather brief exchanges that helped organize the day ahead. Outside, the early morning environment could feel very different depending on the season. In winter, the sun might rise slowly and weakly, sometimes remaining hidden behind thick clouds or distant mountains. Frost might cover the ground, and the air could feel sharp and cold. In summer, however, the sky often brightened quickly, and daylight spread across fields and coastlines much earlier. During these months, people sometimes rose even before sunrise in order to take full advantage of the long daylight hours. Animals were usually checked soon after waking. Livestock represented one of the most valuable parts of a Viking household's resources. Sheep, goats, cattle, and horses provided food, materials, and labor that supported the entire farmstead. Ensuring their safety overnight was important, but the morning inspection was equally necessary. Animals might need feeding, water, or movement to fresh grazing areas. Any signs of illness or injury had to be noticed early. For coastal communities, the morning routine often extended toward the shoreline. Boats that had rested through the night were inspected for damage or loose equipment. Fishing gear that had been prepared the previous evening could now be carried aboard. In favorable weather, fishermen might push out onto the water soon after dawn, hoping to make use of calm seas and productive fishing grounds. Within the longhouse, food preparation began once the fire was strong enough to support cooking. Breakfast in the Viking Age was usually simple but practical. Leftover food from the previous day, bread made from barley or rye, porridge, or dairy products were common choices. The goal was not elaborate meals but reliable nourishment that provided enough energy for the long hours of labor ahead. As the morning continued, the longhouse that had sheltered the family through the dark hours of the night returned to its daytime role as the center of work and organization. Tools were gathered, doors opened fully, and fresh air entered the hall. The world outside, fields, forests, rivers, and sea, once again became the focus of daily life. Looking back at the entire cycle, the Viking night routine was never simply about sleep. It was part of a larger rhythm that connected evening preparation, nighttime caution, and morning readiness. Every quiet action, tending the fire, securing animals, repairing tools, arranging bedding, played a role in maintaining the stability of the household. In this way, the nightly life of Viking families reveals something essential about their society. The success of their voyages, trade networks, and settlements did not depend only on bravery or exploration. It depended on the careful routines practiced in ordinary homes, night after night, across the farms and villages of Scandinavia. Through these routines, families preserved warmth, security, and readiness, ensuring that each new day could begin with the strength needed to face the challenges of the Viking world. As daylight slowly filled the landscape, the contrast between night and morning became clear inside the Viking longhouse. What had been a quiet shelter during the dark hours now returned to a place of activity and purpose. The fire, once kept small and controlled through the night, burned brighter again. Fresh wood was added, and the flames produced both warmth and light for the household as the day truly began. The transformation from night to day was gradual rather than sudden. Viking households did not operate according to strict clocks or precise schedules. Instead, their routines followed the natural rhythm of sunlight, weather, and seasonal needs. Dawn simply signaled that the period of rest had ended and that work would soon begin again. People moved through familiar tasks that had been repeated for generations. Cooking vessels were placed over the fire, water was heated, and simple food was prepared. Children might be given small responsibilities, learning from an early age how the household functioned. In a farming community, everyone understood that survival depended on cooperation. The night had offered rest and protection, but the coming hours demanded effort. The longhouse itself played a central role in this transition. During the night, it had served mainly as a shelter, a place to conserve heat, protect against darkness, and keep family members close together. But during the day, it also became a workspace. Areas that had held sleeping bedding only hours earlier were cleared and used for sitting, crafting, and preparing tools. The structure of the building allowed it to adapt quickly between these roles. Outside, the world of the Viking Age was already waking as well. Farmers stepped out into the cool morning air to assess the land. The condition of crops, fences, and fields had to be checked regularly. In coastal regions, fishermen might already be preparing to push their boats into the water. Traders and travelers sometimes began journeys early in the morning to maximize the daylight hours available for travel. Morning was also the moment when people paid close attention to the weather. A change in wind direction, cloud movement, or temperature could influence the entire day's work. Scandinavian climates were unpredictable, and careful observation of the natural environment was essential. Knowledge of weather patterns was passed down through experience rather than written instruction. This daily awareness of nature connected closely to the routines that had taken place during the previous night. The fire maintained through the darkness made it possible to cook and warm the hall in the morning. The tools prepared before sleep were ready for immediate use. Animals that had been secured the evening before could now be led out safely to graze or work. Seen together, these routines formed a continuous cycle. The Viking night was not separate from the day that followed. Instead, it served as the bridge between one period of labor and the next. Evening preparation, nighttime caution, and morning renewal were all parts of the same rhythm. When we look at Viking society through this lens, the image becomes far more grounded than the dramatic stories of raids and battles often suggest. The real strength of Norse communities came from their ability to maintain stable households in a demanding environment. Every evening fire carefully managed, every tool repaired by lamplight, and every animal checked before sleep helped ensure that the household remained strong. These quiet routines repeated themselves across thousands of farms and settlements throughout Scandinavia during the Viking Age. While some individuals sailed to distant lands or took part in famous historical events, most people lived their lives within these daily cycles of work and rest. The night routine, simple as it may appear, was one of the hidden foundations that allowed Viking society to endure and expand. And so, as the morning light continued to spread across the northern landscape, another ordinary day began. The longhouse doors opened, people stepped into the fresh air, and the tasks of farming, fishing, crafting, and travel resumed. Behind them, the quiet night that had protected the household faded into memory, ready to return again when the sun eventually slipped back below the horizon. As the day progressed and the Viking household moved fully into its daily activities, the memory of the night still shaped how the day unfolded. The routines that took place after sunset were not isolated moments but part of a carefully balanced cycle that allowed families to endure the challenges of their environment. In many ways, the Viking night routine was a quiet form of planning. Every repaired tool, every secured animal, and every carefully managed ember in the hearth created stability for the coming hours. The environment of Scandinavia demanded this kind of discipline. Long winters, short growing seasons, and unpredictable weather meant that small mistakes could have serious consequences. If tools were left unrepaired, work might slow or fail the next day. If animals were not properly secured at night, they could wander or fall victim to predators. If the fire died out completely during freezing weather, the entire household could wake to dangerous cold. Because of this, evening habits gradually became traditions that families passed down through generations. The importance of these habits also reflected the structure of Viking society itself. Most communities were built around small farms or clusters of households that depended on one another. Each family had its own land, animals, and responsibilities, but survival often required cooperation between neighbors. People shared information, traded goods, and sometimes worked together during busy seasons such as harvest. The routines of the night, gathering in the hall, discussing the day, preparing equipment, helped maintain this sense of organization and readiness. Even the physical design of Viking settlements reflected the rhythm between day and night. Longhouses were often positioned to protect against strong winds while allowing smoke from the hearth to escape through roof openings. Nearby buildings stored food, tools, and materials needed for everyday work. Fences and simple barriers helped manage livestock and mark property boundaries. All of these elements contributed to a small but carefully structured world where the household functioned as the center of stability. When evening eventually returned after another long day of labor, the cycle began again. People gathered once more inside the longhouse, bringing with them the results of the day's work. Wet clothing might be hung near the fire to dry. Fishing nets could be repaired again if they had been damaged. Tools used in the fields might be cleaned and checked. The process was familiar, repeated so often that it required little discussion. Food was prepared again, often using preserved ingredients that had been stored earlier in the year. The meal served not only to satisfy hunger but also to bring everyone together after hours spent outside. Around the fire, people could share news from nearby farms, discuss plans for the following day, or simply enjoy the brief moment of warmth and comfort. Gradually, the light inside the longhouse softened as night returned. Oil lamps flickered gently, and the fire once again became the main source of warmth and illumination. Work slowed as the household began moving toward rest. Bedding was brought out, sleeping areas arranged, and the final small tasks of the day were completed. What makes the Viking night routine so interesting is how ordinary it was. These people were not thinking about history or legend. They were simply doing what was necessary to protect their families and maintain their homes. Yet these quiet, repeated actions formed the foundation of a society that would leave a lasting mark across Europe and beyond. When we imagine the Viking Age today, it is easy to picture dramatic voyages across open seas or encounters with distant kingdoms. But behind every ship that sailed and every trader who traveled stood a household that functioned through these simple nightly rhythms. The fire had to be maintained, the animals secured, the tools prepared, and the family protected. And so, as darkness settled once again over the fields, forests, and coasts of Scandinavia, another Viking household gathered around the hearth. The same steady routines returned: the quiet work, the shared warmth, the careful preparation for tomorrow. In these calm and ordinary moments, the real strength of Viking life continued. Night after night, generation after generation. As evening returned once more to a Viking settlement, the familiar transition from daylight activity to nighttime routine began again. The sun lowered slowly toward the horizon, and the long shadows of buildings, fences, and nearby trees stretched across the land. For people living in the Viking Age, this daily shift in light carried practical meaning. It marked the closing of the outdoor working hours and the return of the household to the protection and warmth of the longhouse. The last tasks of the day were usually completed before darkness fully arrived. Farmers brought animals back toward their shelters or enclosed grazing areas. Boats along the shoreline were secured with ropes and checked against the movement of the tide or wind. Tools used throughout the day were gathered and carried indoors, so they would be protected from moisture, frost, or unexpected storms during the night. These small actions were simple, but each one helped preserve the valuable resources that Viking families depended upon. As people stepped back inside the longhouse, the atmosphere of the building slowly shifted again. The hearth fire was strengthened, fresh fuel placed carefully so that flames would burn steadily through the evening. The glow from the fire filled the central space of the hall, reflecting softly on wooden beams and smoke-darkened walls. Outside, the northern sky gradually dimmed, and the quiet of night began to spread across the surrounding landscape. The evening meal once again formed a central moment in the household's rhythm. After a long day of physical labor, food provided not only nourishment but also a chance for the family to gather and rest together. Meals were rarely elaborate, but they were filling and practical. Stews made from preserved meat or fish, thick porridge, coarse bread, and dairy products were common parts of the Viking diet. What mattered most was that the food provided enough strength to sustain the demanding work of the following day. During these evening hours, the longhouse often felt at its most alive. The fire crackled steadily, voices carried through the hall, and the smell of cooking food mixed with the scent of wood smoke and wool. It was in these moments that family members shared news, discussed plans, and sometimes welcomed visitors who had arrived before nightfall. Travel in the Viking Age could be difficult and unpredictable, so hospitality remained an important part of social life. A traveler arriving near evening might be offered warmth, food, and a place to sleep for the night. Such gestures strengthened connections between households and communities. Guests could bring valuable information from distant regions, news about trade routes, political developments, or changes in local leadership. Once the meal ended, the evening returned to its quieter forms of work. Just as on previous nights, the hours after dinner were often used for tasks that could be completed indoors. Spinning wool, repairing fishing nets, carving wooden tools, or mending clothing were common activities. These tasks required patience and skill but did not demand bright daylight, making them well suited to the dim glow of firelight or small oil lamps. The repetition of these activities created a sense of rhythm that defined Viking household life. Each person understood their role, and each task contributed to the overall strength of the family's resources. The sails that carried Viking ships across the sea, for example, began as threads of wool carefully spun and woven inside longhouses like these. The ropes that held ships steady in harbor were twisted fiber by fiber during quiet evenings beside the hearth. Gradually, as the evening deepened, conversation slowed and work came to an end. The fire was adjusted again, reduced slightly so that it would burn slowly through the night without consuming too much fuel. Doors were checked, animals secured, and the final preparations for sleep began. Bedding was brought out once more, spread along the raised platforms that lined the sides of the longhouse. Layers of wool blankets and animal furs helped trap warmth as the air outside cooled. Families settled into their sleeping places close together, sharing body heat and comfort in the enclosed space of the hall. Beyond the walls, the Viking world grew quiet again. The sea moved gently along the shore, wind passed through forests and across open fields, and the sky darkened above the northern land. Inside the longhouse, however, the steady glow of the hearth remained. And just as it had the night before, the Viking night routine returned to its calm and careful rhythm, protecting the household, conserving its resources, and preparing everyone within it for the challenges of the next day. As the night settled more deeply over the Viking settlement, the longhouse gradually became the center of warmth and quiet stability in an otherwise dark and uncertain landscape. Outside, the fields, forests, and waterways of Scandinavia faded into shadow. In a time without streetlights, electricity, or distant city glow, the darkness could feel immense. The sky often stretched clear above the land, revealing bright stars and sometimes the pale movement of the northern lights. But for most people inside the hall, the world beyond the walls was something sensed more than seen. Within the longhouse, the hearth continued to serve as the heart of the household. Its fire provided the only reliable light and warmth available. Even after the evening work had slowed, someone remained responsible for the careful management of the flames. Firewood or peat was not unlimited, and every household understood the importance of using fuel wisely. The goal was to keep enough heat through the night while avoiding unnecessary waste. A poorly managed fire might burn too quickly, leaving the hall cold before morning. The interior air of the longhouse often carried the layered sense of daily life, with smoke drifted slowly upward toward the roof opening. The smell of wool clothing, leather tools, and stored food mixed with the warmth of the fire. For modern visitors, such an environment might feel heavy or uncomfortable, but for Viking Age families it was simply familiar. It was the atmosphere of safety, shelter, and home. During the later hours of the evening, activity within the hall became quieter and more individual. Some people might continue small tasks for a while longer. Spinning wool required steady hands and patience, and the dim light of the fire was often enough for someone experienced in the craft. Others might inspect tools that had been used during the day, sharpening a blade or adjusting a wooden handle. These actions were not hurried. They were part of a steady rhythm that allowed people to maintain the equipment their livelihoods depended on. Conversation also tended to soften as the night deepened. Earlier discussions about the day's work, weather conditions, or local news slowly gave way to calmer exchanges. People might recall stories of past journeys or family events, but often the quiet companionship of shared space was enough. In a household where many people lived together, moments of peaceful silence could be just as meaningful as conversation. Gradually, signs of sleep began appearing across the hall. Someone might place another piece of wood on the fire before preparing their bedding. Others stretched out along the side platforms where sleeping spaces were arranged. The raised benches along the walls were practical designs that kept sleepers slightly above the colder floor while also providing storage space underneath for tools, clothing, or supplies. Before fully settling down, the household often completed a few final checks. The doors were secured to prevent animals from wandering in or livestock from escaping. Dogs, if present, often position themselves near entrances or along the edges of the hall, instinctively alert to unfamiliar sounds. These animals were trusted companions and valuable protectors during the night. Outside, The night environment continued its own quiet activity. Wind might move gently through trees or sweep across open ground. In coastal areas, waves rolled steadily against the shoreline. During winter, snow sometimes fell silently, covering the land with a soft layer that reflected faint moonlight. In summer, however, the darkness could be shorter and less complete, with twilight lingering for hours. Eventually, the hall settled into its deepest calm. The fire dimmed to a bed of glowing embers, casting only a soft reddish light across the room. Most people slept, their breathing slow and steady after a day of physical labor. Yet even in sleep, Viking households remained connected to the world around them. A sudden change in weather, the bark of a dog, or the restless movement of livestock could quickly wake someone if attention was needed. These quiet nighttime hours reveal something important about Viking life that is often overlooked. While history frequently remembers the dramatic voyages, battles, and discoveries of the Viking Age, the strength of that society depended on ordinary routines like this. The careful tending of fires, the repair of tools, the protection of animals, and the shared shelter of the longhouse all formed the foundation of daily survival. Every ship that sailed across the North Sea, every trader who traveled distant rivers, and every explorer who reached new lands came from households that functioned through these steady rhythms. The Viking night routine, calm and practical, ensured that warmth remained through the darkness, and that the family was ready to rise again when morning returned. And so the embers glowed quietly through the long Scandinavian night, guarding the warmth of the hall until the first pale light of dawn signaled the beginning of another day. As the night moved toward its quietest hours, the Viking longhouse entered a stage of deep stillness that was both fragile and reassuring. The embers in the hearth glowed steadily, casting faint pulses of red light across the wooden interior. Smoke drifted slowly upward through the roof opening, disappearing into the cold night air above. Most members of the household were asleep now, resting after a long day of work that may have begun before sunrise. Sleep in the Viking Age was closely tied to physical exhaustion. Farming, fishing, herding animals, building structures, and maintaining equipment all required significant effort. Unlike modern work that often takes place indoors, much of Viking life unfolded in the open air, exposed to wind, cold, rain, and changing seasons. By the time darkness settled over the landscape, fatigue usually arrived naturally. Even in a hall filled with quiet sounds and shifting shadows, people were able to rest. The sleeping arrangements themselves reflected both practicality and community. Along the sides of the longhouse, raised wooden platforms served as the main sleeping spaces. These platforms were wide enough for bedding made from straw, wool, or furs. Families often slept near one another, not only because of limited space but also because shared warmth helped combat the cold northern climate. Thick wool blankets and animal skins provided insulation, trapping heat beneath their layers. Although the household slept, the longhouse remained a place of quiet awareness. The environment inside the building was never completely silent. The slow crackle of the hearth, the shifting of wooden beams as temperatures changed, and the breathing of people and animals created a soft background of sound. These noises became familiar signals that people learned to recognize. Over time, individuals could distinguish between the ordinary sounds of the house and something unusual that might require attention. Animals nearby also contributed to the rhythm of the night. In many Viking settlements, livestock were kept in structures close to the longhouse, sometimes even within attached sections of the building. Cattle, goats, and sheep represented wealth and survival. They provided milk, meat, wool, leather, and in some cases labor. Because of their value, households remained attentive to any disturbances that might affect them. A restless animal, an unfamiliar noise outside, or the barking of a dog could wake someone quickly. Dogs were especially important during the night. Their sharp hearing made them reliable guardians of the household. If a stranger approached the farmstead or if wildlife moved too close to livestock, dogs were often the first to react. Their presence helped provide early warning in a world where darkness limited human visibility. Beyond the walls of the longhouse, the wider Viking landscape continued its quiet motion. The wind moved across open fields and through dense forests. Rivers flowed steadily toward the sea, and waves rolled along rocky coastlines. Boats tied along landing places rocked gently with the water, their ropes creaking softly against wooden hulls. These sounds formed the distant background of Viking life, constant reminders that nature never fully rested. The sky above Scandinavia often added its own presence to the night. On clear evenings, the stars appeared bright and numerous without the interference of artificial light. In northern regions, people might occasionally witness the slow movement of the aurora borealis, the northern lights, glowing softly across the dark sky. While we cannot know exactly how Viking Age communities interpreted these lights, they certainly would have been familiar sights in the northern world. Inside the hall, however, the most important concern remained the preservation of warmth. During the coldest months of winter, temperatures outside could fall far below freezing. The longhouse structure, built with timber frames and sometimes covered with turf, provided insulation but could not completely block the cold. This made the hearth essential not only for cooking but for survival itself. Even while sleeping, someone in the household might wake briefly during the night to check the fire. Adding a small piece of fuel or adjusting the embers ensured that warmth remained until morning. This simple act was a quiet but important responsibility. If the fire died entirely during freezing weather, the longhouse could become dangerously cold before dawn. For many people, the night passed in cycles of sleep and brief waking moments. A person might wake to adjust bedding, listen for unusual sounds, or simply turn closer toward the warmth of the fire. These interruptions were normal and did not necessarily disturb the overall rest of the household. Slowly, as the deepest part of the night passed, subtle changes began to occur in the environment outside. The air often grew colder just before dawn, and the darkness of the sky softened almost imperceptibly. In coastal settlements, seabirds sometimes stirred before sunrise. In farming areas, roosters might call as the first faint light approached the horizon. Inside the longhouse, these small signals of morning would soon begin to wake the household once again. Someone would rise to stir the embers back into flame, feeding the fire with fresh wood. Gradually, the glow of the hearth would brighten the hall, pushing back the final shadows of night. The Viking night routine, calm and practical, had carried the household safely through the dark hours. Soon another day of labor and responsibility would begin. As the night moved toward its quietest hours, the Viking longhouse entered a stage of deep stillness that was both fragile and reassuring. The embers in the hearth glowed steadily, casting faint pulses of red light across the wooden interior. Smoke drifted slowly upward through the roof opening, disappearing into the cold night air above. Most members of the household were asleep now, resting after a long day of work that may have begun before sunrise. Sleep in the Viking Age was closely tied to physical exhaustion. Farming, fishing, herding animals, building structures, and maintaining equipment all required significant effort. Unlike modern work that often takes place indoors, much of Viking life unfolded in the open air, exposed to wind, cold, rain, and changing seasons. By the time darkness settled over the landscape, fatigue usually arrived naturally. Even in a hall filled with quiet sounds and shifting shadows, people were able to rest. The sleeping arrangements themselves reflected both practicality and community. Along the sides of the longhouse, raised wooden platforms served as the main sleeping spaces. These platforms were wide enough for bedding made from straw, wool, or furs. Families often slept near one another, not only because of limited space but also because shared warmth helped combat the cold northern climate. Thick wool blankets and animal skins provided insulation, trapping heat beneath their layers. Although the household slept, the longhouse remained a place of quiet awareness. The environment inside the building was never completely silent. The slow crackle of the hearth, the shifting of wooden beams as temperatures changed, and the breathing of people and animals created a soft background of sound. These noises became familiar signals that people learned to recognize. Over time, individuals could distinguish between the ordinary sounds of the house and something unusual that might require attention. Animals nearby also contributed to the rhythm of the night. In many Viking settlements, livestock were kept in structures close to the longhouse, sometimes even within attached sections of the building. Cattle, goats, and sheep represented wealth and survival. They provided milk, meat, wool, leather, and in some cases labor. Because of their value, households remained attentive to any disturbances that might affect them. A restless animal, an unfamiliar noise outside, or the barking of a dog could wake someone quickly. Dogs were especially important during the night. Their sharp hearing made them reliable guardians of the household. If a stranger approached the farmstead or if wildlife moved too close to livestock, dogs were often the first to react. Their presence helped provide early warning in a world where darkness limited human visibility. Beyond the walls of the longhouse, the wider Viking landscape continued its quiet motion. The wind moved across open fields and through dense forests. Rivers flowed steadily toward the sea, and waves rolled along rocky coastlines. Boats tied along landing places rocked gently with the water, their ropes creaking softly against wooden hulls. These sounds formed the distant background of Viking life, constant reminders that nature never fully rested. The sky above Scandinavia often added its own presence to the night. On clear evenings, the stars appeared bright and numerous without the interference of artificial light. In northern regions, people might occasionally witness the slow movement of the aurora borealis, the northern lights, glowing softly across the dark sky. While we cannot know exactly how Viking Age communities interpreted these lights, they certainly would have been familiar sights in the northern world. Inside the hall, however, the most important concern remained the preservation of warmth. During the coldest months of winter, temperatures outside could fall far below freezing. The longhouse structure, built with timber frames and sometimes covered with turf, provided insulation but could not completely block the cold. This made the hearth essential not only for cooking but for survival itself. Even while sleeping, someone in the household might wake briefly during the night to check the fire. Adding a small piece of fuel or adjusting the embers ensured that warmth remained until morning. This simple act was a quiet but important responsibility. If the fire died entirely during freezing weather, the longhouse could become dangerously cold before dawn. For many people, the night passed in cycles of sleep and brief waking moments. A person might wake to adjust bedding, listen for unusual sounds, or simply turn closer toward the warmth of the fire. These interruptions were normal and did not necessarily disturb the overall rest of the household. Slowly, as the deepest part of the night passed, subtle changes began to occur in the environment outside. The air often grew colder just before dawn, and the darkness of the sky softened almost imperceptibly. In coastal settlements, seabirds sometimes stirred before sunrise. In farming areas, roosters might call as the first faint light approached the horizon. Inside the longhouse, these small signals of morning would soon begin to wake the household once again. Someone would rise to stir the embers back into flame, feeding the fire with fresh wood. Gradually, the glow of the hearth would brighten the hall, pushing back the final shadows of night. The Viking night routine, calm and practical, had carried the household safely through the dark hours. Soon another day of labor and responsibility would begin. As the morning light strengthened and spread across the Viking landscape, the longhouse that had sheltered the family through the night slowly transformed once again into the center of daytime life. What had been a quiet place of rest only hours earlier now filled with movement and purposeful activity. The fire burned steadily in the hearth, its flames brighter now as fresh fuel was added. The warmth it produced continued to push away the chill of the early northern morning. With the sleeping spaces cleared and the household fully awake, the rhythm of work began to take shape. Each member of the household usually had a role shaped by age, skill, and experience. Older adults often directed the most demanding work, while younger members learned through participation. Children in Viking communities were not separated from daily labor. Instead, they observed and gradually joined in, learning the tasks that would eventually become their own responsibilities. Stepping outside the longhouse in the early morning often revealed a world that felt fresh and quiet after the darkness of the night. Dew might cover the grass during warmer months, while frost could form delicate patterns on the ground during colder seasons. The sky, now brighter, stretched across the surrounding hills, forests, or coastline depending on where the settlement stood. For many people, this moment of stepping outside offered the first clear sense of the day's conditions. Weather observation remained one of the most important parts of the morning routine. Viking communities depended heavily on the natural environment, and small changes in weather could affect the entire day's plans. A shift in wind might influence whether fishing boats could safely leave the shore. Clouds gathering on the horizon might warn of approaching rain that could slow work in the fields. Over generations, people developed a careful awareness of these signs, reading the sky and landscape as part of everyday knowledge. Meanwhile, the animals that had been secured during the night now required attention. Sheep and goats were often released to graze, while cattle might be led toward pastures. In many settlements, livestock were central to the household's survival. Milk could be turned into butter or cheese, wool could be spun into thread and woven into cloth, and animals themselves could provide meat when necessary. Caring for these animals each morning ensured that the household's resources remained stable. In coastal communities, the focus of morning activity often turned toward the water. Boats that had rested through the night were inspected carefully before being used. Even small vessels represented significant investment in labor and materials. Their wooden hulls had to be maintained, ropes checked, and equipment prepared. Fishing nets repaired during the previous evening might now be loaded onto the boat, ready to be used in nearby waters. The connection between the night routine and the morning routine became especially clear during these moments. Tasks completed the evening before, repairing nets, sharpening tools, preparing ropes, allowed the morning work to begin quickly and efficiently. Without those quiet hours of preparation beside the fire, valuable daylight might be lost. Back inside the longhouse, the fire continued to support the household throughout the early part of the day. Cooking vessels might remain over the flames as additional food was prepared or leftovers warmed. The hearth remained a central gathering point whenever people returned indoors briefly between tasks. At the same time, the interior of the hall continued to function as a place of craft and production. Even during the day, some members of the household might remain inside working on tasks such as weaving, carving wood, repairing tools, or preparing food for later use. Viking homes were not only shelters but also workshops where many of the materials needed for daily life were produced. This steady pattern of work, preparation, and cooperation formed the true structure of Viking society. While the stories of exploration and seafaring capture the imagination, most people spent their lives maintaining households that depended on careful routine. The night routine, with its quiet work, shared meals, and watchful rest, was only one part of a larger rhythm that allowed these communities to survive in a challenging northern climate. And so the cycle continued. Morning activity gradually expanded into the full work of the day, just as evening would later guide everyone back toward the longhouse again. When the sun eventually lowered once more and shadows stretched across the land, the same familiar routines would return. The fire strengthened, tools repaired, animals secured, and bedding prepared. Through these repeated patterns, Viking households created stability in a world that could often be unpredictable. Night after night, generation after generation, the glow of the hearth inside the longhouse marked the quiet center of Viking life, a place where warmth, family, and preparation carried people safely through the darkness until the light of another day returned. As the morning work spread across the farmstead and surrounding land, the memory of the night's quiet routine remained woven into the structure of the day. Viking households did not treat night simply as a break from activity. Instead, it was one part of a continuous cycle that connected preparation, rest, and renewed effort. The actions taken before sleep, securing animals, checking tools, and maintaining the hearth, allowed the day to begin with order rather than confusion. Across Scandinavia during the Viking Age, this pattern repeated itself in thousands of small communities. Most families lived on farms that balanced agriculture, animal husbandry, fishing, and craft production. Each of these activities required careful planning, and the rhythm between day and night helped maintain that balance. Even though the Viking Age is often remembered for exploration and long-distance travel, the majority of people lived their lives close to home, guided by these steady routines. The longhouse remained the central anchor of this way of life. Its structure reflected both practicality and adaptation to the northern climate. Thick timber frames, sometimes reinforced with turf or stone, helped shield the interior from cold winds. The roof opening allowed smoke from the hearth to escape, though not always perfectly. The result was an interior that could feel smoky and dim by modern standards, but it provided the warmth and protection necessary for survival in a challenging environment. Inside this space, the hearth continued to symbolize the heart of the household. Fire was essential not only for warmth but for cooking, lighting, and daily work. Because of its importance, the routines surrounding the hearth were carefully preserved. In the evening, fuel was managed so the fire could last through the night. In the morning, the embers were revived to restore heat and light. This simple cycle repeated every day and formed one of the quiet foundations of Viking life. Throughout the daylight hours, members of the household moved between indoor and outdoor tasks. Farmers worked in fields when the season allowed, tending crops such as barley, rye, or oats. Livestock required constant attention, especially during colder months when grazing could become difficult. Fishing communities focused their efforts on nearby rivers, lakes, or coastal waters, relying on boats and nets that required frequent repair. Craft production also remained an essential part of daily life. Much of the clothing, tools, and equipment used by Viking communities were produced within the household itself. Wool from sheep was spun into thread, woven into cloth, and eventually turned into garments or blankets. Woodworking produced everyday items such as bowls, handles, and structural components for buildings or boats. Iron tools, though often produced by specialized smiths, still required sharpening and maintenance within the home. The evening hours once again offered the time needed for these quieter forms of work. After returning from the fields or the water, families gathered around the hearth where the light and warmth allowed tasks to continue even after sunset. The rhythm of spinning, mending, and carving created a steady background to conversation and shared time. These routines also helped strengthen the sense of family and community that supported Viking society. Living closely together within the longhouse meant that people shared not only space but also responsibilities. Knowledge passed from one generation to the next through observation and participation. Young members of the household learned how to maintain tools, care for animals, and manage the daily tasks that sustained life. As evening approached once more and the daylight faded across the northern landscape, the household gradually returned to its nighttime rhythm. Animals were brought in or secured, tools were gathered, and the fire was strengthened again. The familiar cycle repeated itself just as it had countless times before. Seen from a distance of many centuries, these routines may appear simple. Yet they formed the stable core of a society capable of remarkable achievements. The ships that carried Norse explorers across the North Atlantic were built and maintained by communities that understood discipline, cooperation, and preparation. The trade networks that connected Scandinavia with distant lands relied on households strong enough to support those journeys. When darkness finally settled again over the fields, forests, and coasts of the Viking world, families gathered once more within the protective walls of the longhouse. The fire glowed steadily, tools were set aside, and quiet work continued under the soft light of the hearth. Night after night, through winter storms and summer evenings alike, this routine protected the household and prepared it for the day to come. In these calm, steady moments, far from the noise of battle or the excitement of distant travel, the real strength of Viking life quietly endured. As evening slowly returned once again to the Viking settlement, the long day of work began to settle into a quieter pace. The sun lowered toward the horizon, and its fading light stretched across fields, shorelines, and forest edges. For people living in the Viking Age, this daily transition carried both familiarity and importance. The daylight hours had been filled with labor, tending animals, working the land, repairing tools, or fishing along the coast. Now, as the light weakened, attention gradually shifted back toward the longhouse. The final outdoor tasks of the day were often completed carefully and without haste. Farmers gathered animals that had been grazing through the afternoon, guiding them back toward enclosures or nearby shelters. Gates were checked and simple fences inspected. Even small mistakes, such as leaving an opening unsecured, could allow animals to wander during the night. Since livestock represented food, materials, and long-term security, their safety was always a priority. Near the shoreline, fishing boats and small trading vessels were secured before darkness arrived. Viking boats were valuable tools that required constant attention. Their wooden hulls needed to remain dry and protected, and ropes had to be tied properly so that changing winds or tides would not cause damage. After a day on the water, nets might be rinsed, untangled, or carried back toward the longhouse for repair during the evening hours. As people stepped back inside the longhouse, the atmosphere changed in a way that was deeply familiar to those who lived in such spaces. The hearth fire was strengthened with fresh fuel, and its warm glow gradually spread through the interior. The smell of wood smoke mixed with the sense of wool clothing, leather equipment, and the remains of the day's cooking. Outside, the landscape dimmed, but inside the hall a quiet sense of safety returned. The evening meal once again formed the central moment of gathering. Family members who had spent hours working in different areas of the farmstead now sat together around the fire. Meals were usually simple but filling. Thick porridge made from grains, pieces of bread, preserved fish or meat, and dairy products often appeared on the table. The goal was not variety or luxury, but nourishment strong enough to support another demanding day of labor. Conversation during the meal often reflected the concerns of daily life. People discussed the condition of crops, the health of animals, or the changing patterns of weather. In communities connected to trade or travel, news from other regions sometimes appeared through visitors or returning sailors. Stories of distant markets, political changes, or unusual events could travel far across the Viking world through these evening conversations. Once the meal ended, the hall returned to a quieter form of activity. The firelight and small oil lamps provided enough illumination for certain kinds of indoor work. Spinning wool, repairing clothing, twisting rope, or fixing fishing nets were common tasks that could continue well after sunset. These repetitive forms of work required patience and skill but did not demand bright daylight. This evening labor played a surprisingly important role in the wider Viking world. The great sails that carried longships across northern seas were made from wool carefully spun and woven in homes like these. The ropes that held ships steady against the wind were twisted fiber by fiber beside hearth fires. Even the clothing worn during long voyages began as thread prepared during calm evenings in village longhouses. Gradually, as the night deepened, the pace of activity slowed. The fire was adjusted again so that it would burn steadily through the night without consuming too much fuel. Doors were checked and animals nearby were listened for. Dogs often settled near the entrance, their alert hearing acting as an extra layer of protection for the household. Bedding was then brought out along the raised platforms that lined the walls of the longhouse. Wool blankets, furs, and simple mattresses were arranged carefully to preserve warmth. Families usually slept close together, sharing heat during the colder hours of the northern night. Beyond the walls of the hall, the Viking landscape returned to darkness. Forests stood quiet under the night sky. Waves moved slowly along distant shorelines, and the cold air settled across the land. Inside the longhouse, however, the glow of the hearth remained steady. And so the familiar Viking night routine began again. A calm sequence of preparation, warmth, quiet work, and rest. Night after night, these routines protected the household and ensured that when morning came, the people inside would once again be ready to step into the demanding but enduring rhythm of Viking life. As the night deepened further and the fire settled into a steady glow, the Viking longhouse often reached its most peaceful moment. The busier part of the evening had passed. Tools had been put away, spinning wheels slowed, and the quiet rhythm of conversation gradually faded. What remained was the soft presence of the hearth and the sense that the household had safely gathered itself inside before the darkness outside grew complete. The fire was never simply decoration. It was the center of the home in the most literal sense. The hearth warmed the entire hall, provided the only reliable light, and allowed food to be cooked even after sunset. Because of this, tending the fire was one of the most important responsibilities during the night. Before sleeping, someone would often check the arrangement of the wood or peat carefully. Too much fuel could cause the fire to burn too quickly, while too little could allow it to die out before morning. The ideal fire for the night was slow and steady, producing warmth without large flames. Around the edges of the hall, the sleeping platforms began to fill. These raised wooden benches lined the walls of many Viking longhouses and served several purposes throughout the day. During daylight hours, they were used for sitting, working, or storing items underneath. At night, they became the household's sleeping spaces. Bedding was usually made from materials that could trap heat effectively: thick wool blankets, animal furs, and sometimes simple mattresses filled with straw or feathers. Privacy in these sleeping arrangements was limited by modern standards. Families often slept close together, sometimes with several people sharing the same platform. But this closeness had practical advantages. Shared body heat helped maintain warmth during the long northern nights, especially in winter. It also reinforced the sense of family unity that was central to life in the Viking Age. Even after most people had settled down to sleep, the longhouse remained connected to the outside world through sound. Viking buildings were strong, but they were not sealed structures like modern houses. Wind could move across the roof, and distant noises could sometimes reach the interior. Over time, people learned to recognize these sounds. The creak of timber in the wind or the shifting of animals nearby was normal. But unusual sounds, perhaps a dog barking sharply or livestock becoming restless, might draw someone awake for a moment of careful listening. Dogs were valuable companions during the night. Their hearing was far sharper than that of humans, and they often acted as early warning systems for the household. If a stranger approached the farmstead, if wildlife came too close to the animals, or if something unexpected disturbed the quiet surroundings, a dog would usually react first. Their presence added a layer of security during the long hours of darkness. Outside, the Viking landscape moved through its own quiet rhythms. In coastal areas, waves rolled slowly against the shore, and boats tied to simple landing places shifted gently with the water. In forested regions, wind could move through tall trees, producing a steady rustling sound. During winter, snow sometimes fell silently across fields and rooftops, creating a calm but heavy stillness across the land. For people inside the longhouse, these sounds formed the background of nightly life. The darkness outside might have been vast, but the hall provided a small circle of warmth and safety. The thick beams, the glowing hearth, and the presence of family created a sense of protection that allowed the household to rest. Sleep itself was often practical rather than luxurious. After a day filled with physical labor, farming, fishing, crafting, or building, exhaustion made rest come naturally. Even with the smoke of the hearth and the occasional noise of animals or wind, most people slept deeply enough to recover their strength. Still, the night was rarely completely uninterrupted. Someone might wake briefly to adjust a blanket, check the fire, or simply listen to the quiet sounds of the hall. These small awakenings were normal and rarely disturbing. In fact, historians believe that sleep in pre-modern societies was sometimes lighter and more flexible than the continuous sleep patterns many people experience today. As the hours passed and the fire slowly burned down, the longhouse rested in calm stillness. Outside, the stars moved across the sky, and the cold air settled over the fields and forests of Scandinavia. Inside, the steady warmth of the hearth continued to protect the household from the darkness. In these quiet moments, the Viking night routine revealed its deeper purpose. It was not merely about ending the day. It was about preserving warmth, maintaining safety, and giving the household the rest it needed to face another demanding day when morning returned. And so the embers glowed softly through the long northern night, guarding the heart of the home until the faint light of dawn would once again signal that it was time to wake, stir the fire, and begin the steady rhythm of Viking life all over again. As the night continued to pass over the Viking landscape, the longhouse held its quiet balance between warmth and darkness. The embers of the hearth glowed softly in the center of the hall, casting dim red light that moved gently across wooden beams and smoke-darkened walls. Most of the household remained asleep now, wrapped beneath layers of wool blankets and animal furs. Outside, the world was silent except for the distant sounds of wind, water, and animals shifting in the night. For people living in the Viking Age, the night was never completely empty of awareness. Even while resting, individuals remained loosely connected to the environment around them. A sudden noise could wake someone quickly. This kind of attentiveness was not born from fear but from experience. In a world where weather could change quickly and animals represented valuable resources, being able to respond to unusual sounds was part of everyday survival. The animals kept near the household played an important role in this nighttime awareness. Sheep, goats, and cattle often rested in nearby structures or enclosed areas not far from the longhouse. Their presence could sometimes be heard through the night. A shifting hoof, a low movement of cattle, or the soft rustle of straw. These were familiar sounds that people quickly learned to recognize as normal. Occasionally, however, the behavior of animals could signal that something unusual was happening. A sudden burst of movement, repeated noises, or the sharp barking of a dog might draw someone awake. Dogs were especially valuable companions during the night. Their senses were sharper than those of humans, and they often noticed disturbances long before people did. If wildlife approached the farmstead or a stranger moved nearby, the reaction of a dog could alert the entire household. Beyond the immediate area of the farmstead, the wider Viking landscape moved through its own nighttime rhythms. In coastal regions, waves continued to roll slowly against the shoreline, and boats tied along the water shifted gently with the tide. The creaking of rope against wood could sometimes carry faintly across the quiet night air. These boats were among the most valuable possessions of many households, so people remained attentive to strong winds or sudden weather changes that might threaten them. In inland farming regions, the sounds of the night were different but equally familiar. Wind moving through tall grass or forest trees created steady patterns of sound that people learned to recognize. During colder seasons, the sharp stillness of winter nights could make the environment seem almost completely silent. Snow, when it fell, softened many of the usual sounds of the landscape. Inside the longhouse, warmth remained the most important concern. The fire that had been carefully managed throughout the evening now burned quietly as a bed of glowing coals. These embers were protected throughout the night because they made it easier to restore the fire at dawn. Starting a new fire from nothing could be difficult, especially in damp or freezing conditions. So preserving the coals was a practical habit shared across many households. From time to time, someone might wake briefly and add a small piece of wood to the embers or adjust the arrangement of the fuel. These quiet actions helped maintain the warmth of the hall without creating large flames that would consume fuel too quickly. In colder months, even a small amount of heat could make a significant difference in comfort and safety. Sleep during the Viking Age was shaped by the natural cycles of darkness and light. Without artificial lighting, people often followed the rhythm of sunset and sunrise more closely than many do today. After a long day of physical work, fatigue usually brought sleep soon after darkness settled in. But the night itself could include brief waking moments, checking the fire, adjusting bedding, or simply turning closer toward the warmth of the hearth. Gradually, as the deepest hours of the night passed, subtle changes began to appear in the world outside the longhouse. The air sometimes grew colder just before dawn, and the sky slowly shifted from deep black to a softer shade of gray. These changes were often too slight to notice immediately, but over time they signaled that morning was approaching. Inside the hall, the household remained quiet for a little while longer. The fire's embers glowed steadily, protecting the warmth within the walls. Blankets rose and fell with the slow breathing of sleeping family members. Tools rested along the edges of the hall, waiting for another day of work. In these final hours before dawn, the Viking night routine reached its calmest point. The household had completed its preparations, the fire was secure, and the people inside were resting. Soon the first person would wake, stir the embers back into flame, and begin the transition toward morning once again. But for a few peaceful moments more, the longhouse remained still, a small island of warmth and quiet life beneath the vast northern sky. As the final hours of night slowly passed, the Viking longhouse rested in a calm that had been carefully maintained through routine and habit. The embers in the hearth still glowed faintly, giving off a quiet warmth that spread through the hall. Though the flames were small now, they were enough to keep the chill from creeping fully inside. The management of that fire, done thoughtfully before sleep, had allowed the household to remain comfortable throughout the dark hours. Outside, the land of Scandinavia remained wrapped in darkness, but subtle changes were beginning to take place. The stars above slowly shifted their positions across the sky, and the horizon far to the east began to soften ever so slightly. These small changes often went unnoticed at first, yet they signaled the slow approach of morning. Inside the longhouse, most people were still asleep. Their bedding of wool and furs formed thick layers along the raised platforms that lined the hall. The sleeping spaces had been arranged the evening before, just as they had been arranged countless nights before that. Over generations, Viking households developed practical ways of managing warmth, space, and comfort within the longhouse. Sleeping close together helped preserve body heat, especially during winter when temperatures outside could fall sharply during the night. Although sleep filled most of the hall, the longhouse was never completely silent. Small sounds continued to move through the building. The low crackle of the hearth, the shifting of timber as temperatures changed, and the quiet breathing of family members formed a familiar background. These sounds became part of everyday life, so ordinary that they rarely disturbed anyone's rest. From time to time, one of the household members might stir briefly. Perhaps they adjusted their blanket or turned closer to the warmth of the hearth. In colder months, someone might rise quietly to check the embers. A small piece of wood could be placed onto the glowing coals to ensure the fire would last until dawn. These simple actions were not dramatic, but they were essential. Without them, the fire might fade too quickly, leaving the hall cold before morning arrived. The animals outside also contributed to the gentle rhythm of the night. Livestock resting in nearby shelters sometimes shifted in the straw or moved quietly in their enclosures. These movements were normal and reassuring. They reminded the household that the animals were safe and present. Since livestock represented food, clothing materials, and long-term security, their well-being was always on the minds of the people who cared for them. Dogs often slept lightly near entrances or along the edges of the hall. Their presence provided both companionship and protection. Even in sleep, a dog might react quickly to unfamiliar sounds beyond the farmstead. If wildlife wandered too close or a stranger approached the settlement, the alertness of a dog could awaken the household long before danger became serious. Beyond the immediate farmstead, the wider Viking world moved quietly through the night. In coastal settlements, the sea continued its steady motion, waves rolling gently against rocks and wooden docks. Boats tied along the shore rocked softly with the water, their ropes creaking faintly in the still air. In forested regions, wind moved through tall trees, creating a distant rustling sound that blended with the quiet of the land. Winter nights brought their own atmosphere. Snowfall, when it came, often covered the landscape with remarkable silence. The thick layer of snow softened many of the usual sounds, making the night feel even more still. During summer, however, the darkness might not be complete. In northern regions, twilight could linger for hours, leaving a faint glow in the sky long after the sun had set. Within the longhouse, these seasonal differences shaped how people experienced the night. In winter, the extended darkness encouraged longer periods of indoor activity before sleep. Families spent more time near the hearth, spinning wool, repairing tools, or sharing stories. In summer, when daylight lasted much longer, the evening routine sometimes began later, and the night itself felt shorter. Eventually, the faint signs of morning began to grow stronger. The sky outside shifted from deep black to pale gray. The cold air just before sunrise often felt sharper than earlier in the night. In some places, birds began to stir before the sun appeared, their calls carrying through the quiet morning air. Inside the longhouse, the first person to wake might notice these changes. They would move quietly toward the hearth, crouching beside the bed of glowing embers. With careful hands, they stirred the coals and added small pieces of wood. Slowly, the fire would brighten again, flames rising gently from the ashes. The return of the fire's light marked the beginning of a new day. Its glow spread across the hall, revealing the familiar shapes of tools, benches, and sleeping forms beneath blankets. Soon others would wake, bedding would be folded away, and the longhouse would shift once again from a place of rest to a place of work. The Viking night routine, calm and steady, had carried the household safely through the darkness. Through careful habits, tending the fire, securing animals, and sharing the warmth of the hall, families prepared themselves for the challenges of another day. And as the first pale light of dawn touched the land outside, the quiet embers of the hearth once again became the flames that would guide the household into the rhythm of Viking life. As the first pale light of dawn slowly touched the horizon, the Viking longhouse moved gently from night into morning. The darkness that had surrounded the household for hours began to fade, replaced by a cool gray glow spreading across the sky. Inside the hall, the embers in the hearth were stirred once more, and small flames rose again from the ashes. The quiet warmth of the fire slowly brightened the room, revealing the familiar shapes of benches, tools, and sleeping blankets. One by one, members of the household began to wake. After a night of rest beside the hearth, people stretched beneath their blankets and listened to the early sounds of morning. Outside, birds had begun to call, and livestock stirred in their enclosures. The stillness of night was giving way to the quiet movement of a new day. Bedding was folded and set aside as the longhouse returned to its daytime form. The platforms used for sleeping once again became places for sitting, working, and gathering. Someone added more wood to the fire, and soon the hearth burned strongly enough for cooking. A simple breakfast would follow, offering the strength needed for another full day of labor. When the doors of the longhouse finally opened, the fresh northern air flowed inside. Fields, forests, and shorelines slowly came back to life beneath the rising sun. Farmers stepped out to check their animals, fishermen looked toward the water, and tools prepared the night before were ready to be used. The Viking night routine had quietly done its work. Through careful habits, tending the fire, securing the animals, repairing tools, and sharing warmth beneath one roof, the household had carried itself safely through the darkness. These simple routines, repeated night after night, formed the quiet foundation of Viking life. While history often remembers the Viking Age for its voyages and distant adventures, the strength of that world began here, in the steady rhythm of the longhouse. Around the glow of the hearth, families prepared, rested, and gathered the strength needed for the day ahead. And as the sun rose higher above the Scandinavian landscape, the longhouse stood ready once again, waiting for evening to return, when the fire would glow softly and the calm, familiar rhythm of the Viking night would begin all over again.